Join us on an exclusive trip to London in May 2025. Highlights of this tour are a glove-making masterclass with luxury designer Rena O, an embroidery workshop at Hand and Lock, a visit to a renowned theatrical costume house, and a guided tour of Savile Row. We'll also visit specialty fabric shops and enjoy afternoon tea at Fortnum & Mason. To find out more, go to threadsmagazine.com. Welcome to Sewing with Threads, the monthly podcast from Threads Magazine. I'm Janine Clegg, co-hosting with Threads editor Carol Frasia. Hello, Carol.
Hi, Janine.
Our guest today is Gretchen Hirsch, the founder of Charm Patterns, known to many as Gertie. She's a pattern designer, teacher, the author of 6 sewing-related books, and a lover of 1950s fashion and other vintage styles. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to see you both.
Yes, likewise. And Happy New Year, too. We're recording this pretty much right after the new year has turned over. And we want to just chat a bit about creating fitted bodices with you. It's a topic that we are pretty sure is near and dear to you.
It sure is. It sure is. I love this topic, by the way.
Well, good. Your most recent book, Gertie's Charm Sewing Studio, you provide instructions and access to 3 new patterns that are based on classic designs. The Madeline dress, the Camille sheath, and Lillian jacket. I think I have that right. And these patterns have extended sizing and are very fitted. But unlike some of your other patterns, there's no boning involved. And I'm wondering, how did you achieve the structure you want for these garments without the boning?
It is funny that I wrote a book without any patterns with boning in it, because that's kind of been my thing historically. But this book is really different from some of my past books in that it's not primarily a pattern book. I was inspired to write it because I've just always been so inspired by the space that I work in, by my studio here in Newburgh, New York. I just really have felt like it's like this magical place, and there's something about it that's really special. And so that's why it's called the Charm Sewing Studio. And I wanted to sort of use the studio as the setting for this book. And there are 6 chapters, and I take the reader sort of on a journey of creating 6 different patterns that I've already designed. And it's really more of a narrative/fashion history book. So I wanted to include 3 new patterns. So take the reader through the process of designing 6 patterns and then design 3 new ones, sort of talking them through the process of how do you do the research? How do you decide on how something is constructed for a modern sewist? And the 3 patterns that I included just so happened to not really need boning. They were all really based very strongly on historical garments. And the Camille sheath, I think, is the one that I might have considered using boning in, but I was using dresses designed by Alfred Shaheen from the 50s, looking at these dresses, and they didn't have boning. They had the structure that I wanted with just lining and the fabric and the pleats, the darts, all of that was creating the structure. I think one big difference is the undergarments that people wear now and that they wore then, right? So I think at this time you might have worn a boned Mary Widow under your Camille sheath, and it would have given you that structure. And the dress is just sort of like floating over the undergarment. So I was surprised to find that dress didn't have boning, and I really wanted to stick to the historical inspiration, and so did it without. It ended up working really well. We still do a lot of sort of boned strapless and strappy bodices. I think that's sort of our specialty at Charm. We do really fitted bodices with spiral steel boning sewn into the lining primarily. And I think we will never, that will always sort of be our bread and butter at Charm. And I love doing that type of bodice.
And I was wondering also, you mentioned a few years ago that folks always ask if they can leave out the boning in your garments. Were these garments also in response to that? I mean, you just talked about, you wanted to stick with the historical, stick with those, be inspired by those older garments. But I'm wondering if that played a role as well.
Not really. I mean, people do always ask if they can leave out boning, and I try to like encourage people to be brave and try it, and it's not as scary as they think. So, yeah, I do want to challenge people in that way, but I think it was more just really the historical inspiration, and we're still very much pro boning here at Charm. But I also think, as I get a little further in my career, I have been experimenting a little bit more with a bit softer silhouette. I think early on, I was so excited by the techniques of building and structure into garments. And I wanted to do everything in every garment. I really wanted to try everything out. And so I think maybe things were a little over-engineered at times just because I was so excited about the techniques. And now I'm seeing that, looking at some of these vintage garments, I could actually pull back a little and really be very strategic about when and where to include that type of structure.
Gretchen, could you just give us a quick explanation of how the engineering of boning actually works? Like how does it provide that structure on your body and for the garment?
I have to say, I love that you all are asking me this because I really learned all these techniques from Threads magazine. So it just is really tickling me to hear you all ask me this. I'm a longtime fan / reader of Threads magazine, and I learned a lot of these techniques from back issues that I bought on eBay, and I have a whole stack of them still in the studio. And one article in particular really resonated with me, and I still pull it out every now and then in the studio. And the way it works, like you asked and like you all taught me, is that you have this sort of like vertical structure, right? You have these vertical spiral steel bones, and they need to be anchored somewhere. So you have a sort of anchor at the waist, and often we build that in with a waist stay. So you have a lot of structure. A lot of our bodices can stand up on their own because we use muslin underlining plus the spiral steel boning in the lining, and then it won't just stand on your body alone. You need something to anchor it at the waist. And this is where a lot of, I think, like modern strapless bras fail. Like everyone hates strapless bras. There's nothing to anchor them, right? They just slide down your body. So the thing about strapless bodices is they're anchored with that waist stay, and then the vertical bones can do their job.
That is exactly it. And I know exactly what you mean about the strapless bras that just want to wander around. Or nowadays they put that sort of silicone beading in there that's supposed to stick to you. That's terrible. Really not fun.
It's not fun.
In some of your designs, I noticed that the boning goes from the waist up and over the bust point to sort of the top edge. How does that work so that it doesn't kind of remove the bust shaping completely or flatten out the bust shape?
That's a tricky one. That's the hardest one to sew, that one that goes over the princess seam, because it's such a curvy seam. I think I used to think that maybe that wasn't an ideal area for boning, but the more I've seen it at work, if the bodice is fitted closely enough, which it needs to be in these dresses, right? You can't have really any ease in a strapless bone bodice. It needs to be zero ease. So it's held so tightly to the body that it's, spiral steel boning is so great because it bends in both directions. So side to side and then also laterally front to back. So it's curving over the bust and it's being held by the zero ease of the bodice to your body, and it's curving over the bust because of its spiral steel structure. So I found that it works really well. But yeah, you have to be careful that the bone isn't too long so it's not popping out of the seam at the top.
That was my question. How do you decide how long or short to make the boning so that it's not poking you or is not doing its job of giving you the support you need?
I always make it a 1/4 inch shorter than the seam line where it's being inserted. So take away the seam allowances and then take away another 1/4 inch after that. So it has just enough ease to kind of move around. It's not too tight, so it's going to be putting pressure on the neckline seam, and that seems to do the trick.
When you use spiral steel boning, I know that you can buy it in certain lengths, but probably it needs to be customized if you've actually fitted your bodice to yourself. I think nobody's a perfect, 16 inches or whatever it might be. How do you do that? I know there are end caps you can put on and various dips and that sort of thing.
Oh my gosh, what a journey I went on discovering my favorite method for doing all of this. I hate those end caps. They're the worst, and I feel like a lot of books or articles will just say, just put the end cap on with pliers. And then you try to do it at home and you can't get it on. It keeps falling off. So what I found that works best for me for finishing the ends is Teflon tape, also known as plumbing tape, and you can get it at Home Depot or a hardware store. And you just wrap the ends with it and sort of smush it on with your fingers and sort of like sticks to itself. And so that has worked really well for me, and it's easy to source, it's no fuss, and it doesn't come off. So that's my favorite method. In terms of the lengths I buy, you can buy it by the yard. I came across accidentally a method a few years ago when the only length I could get from my local supplier were the 18-inch lengths, which is really long. But I ended up buying a gross of them. So I had 144 of these 18-inch bones. And I found that they're kind of the perfect length because you can cut two shorter bones from them for a bodice, and one end is already finished. And then so you just have to finish one end. So that has become my main method, is to just only buy 18-inch lengths and know that I can usually get two or sometimes more bones out of that length.
Do you ever use any of the other type of boning that exists, the plastic kinds that come with the casing or that you can sew through?
No, I'm really not a fan of the plastic or Ridgeline boning personally, just because I find that it does crease a little bit when it's worn. So for me, I love that spiral steel really holds its shape. The one other type of bone that we sometimes use is the flat bones, so for corsetry kind of work. And that type of bone it's a little harder to cut, but it can be done. And it doesn't bend like spiral steel does. So we've done a pattern for a waist cincher meant to be an undergarment. And that one has the flat steels at center front and center back. So it can only be used on a very straight seam and not anywhere that the body creases in.
Do you have any trouble washing clothes that have steel boning in them?
No, not really. I used to be really sort of delicate about it, and I worried about it a lot. And then I found that you can put them in the washing machine on delicate and line dry these garments. I mean, of course, providing that your fabric will allow that kind of treatment. I did an experiment with a spiral steel bone and put it in a glass of water for a few weeks to see what would happen. Because I think people worry about it rusting, and it never rusts. It just never rusts. It's treated in a certain way that is not a concern. I think the concern would be more that it's sort of the coating starts to come off a little bit and the texture gets a little weird. But hopefully you're not leaving your dresses underwater for weeks at a time, so should not be a concern.
Right. So in general, how do you know where to place the boning? Certainly at seams, but some people maybe need more or less. So how do you know where to place?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've, over time developed my key areas that I want to see bones. Center back is really important because we generally have center back zippers. And so you know how often you'll get like those ripples in a center back zipper on a strapless dress? A bone on either side of the zipper will eliminate that. I like to do side seams there to get a nice smooth silhouette at the side seam. I do front and back princess seams. And then the other key area that I really like is a diagonal bone that goes from the underarm inward towards the front princess seam at the waist. So you know how sometimes you get those diagonal drag lines next to the bust on a strapless bodice? That really helps give more structure and eliminate those drag lines. And one thing I'll say is that we have a really inclusive size range at Charm. We go up to a size 32 dress size. And so one thing that I found is, what I recommended for a sample size is not going to work through our entire range. So I really recommend experimenting for yourself, because you might find, especially like on a back princess seam, you could add 2 or more bones in between, the side seam and the back princess seam, if your size calls for it, or if you feel like you need a little bit more structure in the back.
Certainly, though, it doesn't substitute for making sure that your garment fits first. You do have to do the fitting first, right?
This is true. We can't get out of that step. Yeah, so doing a muslin is always really important in these types of fitted bodices. And you can also even put boning into your muslin. My favorite technique for that is to use masking tape and to just tape the bone down onto the seam allowances so that you can get a sense of what it's going to look like.
What a great
That
idea.
is a really good tip, because I feel like, as you said, putting in boning isn't necessarily super complicated. It just feels fussy and like, oh my gosh, what if I did it wrong somehow? Or I don't know. I think that sewing along the boning, which is not what's happening, you're just making the casing and then inserting the bone afterwards. But I know that I look at it and think, oh my God, I could break a needle on that. And you're not going to do that if you do it the right way.
That's true. That's true. And I think having the right tools is really important. And one thing that I had to learn early on, I found my favorite type of metal cutters, the Greenlee 722. I recommend it to everyone. You can get it on Amazon. It cuts right through a bone in one go. And early on, people would tell me like, oh, use these tiny little metal snips and you're trying to snip on either end. And I would struggle so much with cutting it. And once I got the right tool, I was like, oh, this is so easy. And then, finding out how I like to finish the ends. It really is not, it's not intimidating or hard at all. You just have to know your approach and have good tools.
Probably practice a few times as well, right?
Yes, and wear protective eyewear.
Get those goggles out. Okay. I want to talk to you for a second about these dresses, the unlined Madeline dress and the Camille sheath. Now, the unlined Madeline dress has a waist stay, and the Camille dress has elastic stays to keep the neckline in place. Do you think these provide enough needed structure?
I'm so excited to talk about these dress patterns, so thank you for asking. The Madeline dress is a princess seam dress that flares out, doesn't have a waistline seam, and it flares out into gores with box pleats. And it has panels that are sewn to the box pleats underneath. So you can use a contrast fabric, which is a really fun treatment to have it sort of peeking out of your box pleats. But what happens with this dress is that you then, since it's unlined, you have all these crazy seam allowances at the waist and unsecured box pleats on the inside of the dress. So we were looking for a really tidy vintage style way to control that mess on the inside of the dress. And Andrea, my production manager who I work with, she has a background in costume design, and she's always thinking of like creative ideas for finishing. And she said, what about some grosgrain tape here? And we do a sort of waist stay treatment. So we sewed the grosgrain ribbon to those seam allowance at the waistline. And then it also serves as a waist stay when you put a hook and eye in the back. So you actually anchor it to your waist. So it gives you a bit of a cinching effect, which is great in this style of dress. And it also controls all those seam allowances on the inside of the dress.
And I would imagine it would support the extra weight of all of those gores and pleats that could be pulling down and causing some drag lines at the top, or just not a good hang on the upper part of the dress.
Exactly. Yes. So that was the thinking behind that one. And then the Camille sheath, I love this dress so much. I could talk about this dress for hours. So just stop me if I go on too long. But this dress was inspired. In 2012, I wrote an article for a sewing magazine about Alfred Shaheen. And I ended up contacting someone from his website. He's since passed, but I contacted the press person, started talking to her, asked if I could interview her. And through the course of the interview, it turns out that it was his daughter. It's Alfred Shaheen's daughter, Camille, and that I named the dress after her. But one of the stories that she told me, she's the main collector of her father's work. So if you don't know Alfred Shaheen, he was a designer in Hawaii in the 50s and did a lot of what we think of as, vintage tropical. He was credited with inventing the Hawaiian shirt. Elvis in Blue Hawaii wears one of his designs. So she is the main collector of his work now because it is just sort of disseminated to vintage sellers, and she's trying to sort of create an archive of his work. And she said one thing that she's found is there's this one dress style called the Shaheen sheath. And she always sees it, when she sees it on eBay or on Etsy or other vintage sites, that vintage sellers don't know what to do with this dress because the neckline appears to be all stretched out. And then it has these elastic lengths inside the bodice. And they think that but they've become stretched out over time, right? Because elastic erodes and completely loses its effectiveness over, 5-6 decades. So people didn't know what to do with this dress and thought, they were like creating, sewing new pleats at the neckline and stitching them down and using the elastic as, dress hangers for, to hang them on the, a hanger. And what she told me is that those elastic stays are what create this design. So the neckline is sort of like, when you look at the pattern piece, it looks like a sort of stretched out scoop neckline. And you wonder how it would ever look good on a body. And then it has points where you tack elastic inside the dress and pull it around to the back, and it forms pleats at the neckline. So it kind of controls that excess in a really beautiful way, but you're still able to move. And it's a really beautiful effect, but no one really understood, no modern vintage seller understood what this dress was. I was always so intrigued by that story. So I ended up, starting to collect some of Shaheen sheaths myself. And it really is fascinating looking at this neckline. And so I always wanted to do this pattern. I'm so excited about it. And so the way we did it was to take the dart excess that you would have in a bodice and rotate it out to the neckline. So it's just a really wide neckline, and then tack the elastic onto the inside, and it just creates this beautiful effect. So that is really the focal point of this design, is those, the pleats at the neckline.
I was looking at photos of this in your book, and it is really a graceful, really pretty sophisticated neckline. I love it too. And I wanted to ask you about how you got the bust shaping into it, whether the darts were rotated up into that part of the neckline, which sounds like that's what you did. So the question I have is, at different points in your size range, does that pleat become bigger or smaller? And how does that affect the overall look of that neckline?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we test our patterns in very rigorously across our size range. And so this was a really tricky one, because we found as we graded it up, we weren't getting the exact right amount of excess at the neckline. So it was a continued testing process to make sure that the pleat looked as beautiful on a size 8 as it does on a size 16 as it does a 32. So we were just continually testing. And also, think about sewing pattern. You have to put that mark. Where do they put the elastic? And it may be different for everyone. So we really encourage people in the book to test it out. This is another great reason to make a muslin. You can safety pin that elastic in at the neckline. See if you like where it's sitting. See if you like the length. The length is going to be different for everyone too. So really important to do that testing process with this dress.
Some of the dresses in the book you recommend making muslins, but others you did not. Is it just because those were easier?
I think we're generally always pro muslin. I know I am, just because, it's so, well, I'm going to say it's impossible to make one sewing pattern that's going to work for every body type. So, we try to get as close to universal as possible. But of course, everyone's going to want to make their own fit adjustments. So I definitely recommend a muslin for pretty much any sewing pattern. But things like the Lillian jacket, that is, requires really intricate fitting, I think. And it has a lot of opportunities for fitting because it has 12 panels. And this jacket was inspired by Lillian jackets and coats from the 50s. That was a brand that's now highly collectible, and I've always really loved. And every name of the pattern in the book has a sort of historical significance. And Lillian was the name of the wife of the man who started this company. So he called it Lillian after her. And so I thought Lillian jacket was fitting. So this jacket has both armhole princess seams and shoulder princess seams, which the reason for that was the historical inspiration, but also we were trying to make the pattern pieces as narrow as possible, because initially we thought they might be printed and we were trying to get them on really small sheets. And so I kept trying to make the pattern pieces as narrow as possible. And I thought, well, it wouldn't have been out of the question. A lot of these Lillian jackets have a lot of panels. And so ended up adding 2 princess seams, and that meant you have all these opportunities for fitting. And so we really recommend that people make a muslin of this in something a little heavier than muslin. I think is a good idea. Something like a cotton canvas or cotton twill will more replicate the structure of a tailoring fabric. And then once you see all those panels, you may want to nip it in here. You might want to take in the front princess seam, the shoulder princess seam. There's just so many seams. There's so many seams that you can work with there that I think the Lillian jacket is a really crucial one to make a muslin on.
I like a lot of seams because I always need to fit further for myself. So I'm looking forward to trying this pattern out.
I can't wait to see your version.
So I wanted to ask you, a number of your designs have what I think you call like a shelf bust bodice, or something where there's a sort of a underbust seam and then some really great decorative pleating or sort of petally stuff happening above that. How do you get that to fit? I mean, how does that work? I'm wondering as an individual when you have the pattern, but I'm thinking also of like you as the pattern designer, how do you make that work for every cup size from A to whatever? I know you go up to a higher cup size.
That pattern was so challenging. I'm thinking of the Liz dress, which we did for Charm Patterns early on, in Charm Patterns. And I really want to replicate that shelf bust style you're talking about, which, it's basically you create through a princess seam bodice, like a shelf for the bust. And then there are cups set in with a pleated detail, or sometimes, in vintage dresses, you would see ruffles or some sort of almost like people call it like a crumb catcher effect or something like that. So you have a sort of like built up shelf on the bust. And then a strap that goes underneath the bodice and twists around the shoulders to the center back. And it's a really challenging pattern to design. It was challenging to fit. I went through 3 pattern graders just through the process of designing that dress. And actually, that's when I met my current pattern drafter / grader. And we've been together ever since, because I was like, if you can get through this dress, I know you can do anything. And she loved the challenge of it, and she's been amazing. So what I ended up doing for that one was that I didn't have mannequins for every bra size that we make. We have A through H cup sizes at Charm, plus dress sizes 2 through, I think I said 32 earlier, but it's 34. So, that's an enormous combination of dress sizes and cup sizes. And we don't have, a mannequin or a fit model for each one of those sizes. And so what I was doing at the time, which was it was just like mad, crazy days. But I bought bras, molded cup bras in a variety of sizes that I was able to like put cups directly on those molded bras to see if the volume was correct for the cup size that I felt it was. And so we were doing crazy things like that, trying it on a variety of people, mannequins, and it was the most laborious pattern we've ever made. And then, once you release it to the public, then people are like, oh my God, how do I fit this to my body? So we do sewing retreats at the Charm studio, and people come in and they can sew whatever pattern of ours that they want. And the Liz dress is the most common one that people bring in, because it really helps to have some fitting guidance. And we fit people in that dress so much. And, everyone is so different, even just the straps. If you have sloped shoulders, those straps are going to fall right off. So, we have to engineer them. Sometimes we put elastic in them, but it's a challenging dress. But I just, I think it's so worth it because of, these vintage styles are so beautiful, and be ashamed to just, let them disappear.
I wanted to ask you again, this is going back to what you said at the very beginning, that one of the sort of mainstays of your designs is the fitted bodice with the sort of the midriff tends to be fitted, and then it's very fitted up and over the bust. And with boning, I think the impression is that the boning is there to mean that your whole body is being supported by the dress. Is that truly the case, or is the boning there to support the dress, and then your body needs other support as well, depending on your size and shape?
I love that question. That's another one we get a lot is, can I forego a bra or, foundation garments if I have boning in the dress? And certainly some people may find that if they're wearing a strapless bodice that's heavily boned, they may, it's closely fitted, they may not need a separate bra. But I think for me, like you said, the boning is there to support the dress, and it supports the structure of the dress. It's not meant to control your body necessarily. So especially, we have a lot of customers who are really into doing true vintage every day. They have that, they want to get that silhouette. So, I like for our photo shoots and recommend for those customers wearing vintage style undergarments, which are really going to shape your body. And then the boning on the dress is there to support the dress itself.
And so what would be the advantage or disadvantage to creating like an entire internal corselet rather than just boning the dress?
I mean, that's something I kind of want to explore in the future, honestly, like the more I get into the history behind these garments. Because if you look at something like, a true Christian Dior from 1947 from the New Look, it probably had, a cotton tulle corselet built into the dress. And that's a really couture approach, and certainly would be something that would control the body and support the dress as well. It would be a heck of a lot of work for one dress. It's sort of like you could build a petticoat into a dress every time you make one, or you could have a separate petticoat and just keep switching that one out. Which one sounds more appealing? I personally don't want to build a petticoat for every single dress I make. So just personally, I think it's probably a little more practical for the modern woman to have like an arsenal of undergarments that she loves and to switch them out between dresses.
That makes good sense to me. I really understand that.
Well, we came out with a petticoat pattern last year, and what we found is no one wants to sew it. I mean, people, our customers really do want to sew petticoats, and there aren't a lot of historically accurate ones available these days to buy. So this is something that people want. But generally, I would say, you probably don't want to sew one of these more than once, because they are really time consuming and just tedious sewing.
So you can buy, I know you can buy like a full skirt petticoat without too much trouble. How does that differ from like a really accurate one that would really work for the style of dresses that you make?
Well, interestingly, there used to be some brands that really replicated this style, the 50s style, where you get a lot of volume under the skirt. And they're becoming harder and harder to source. And the ones that you can get on Amazon are really sort of ineffective, I'll say, because they don't have a lot of layers. They're just, they might be great for everyday wear, but you're not going to look at a picture of a Christian Dior dress and that fit and flare silhouette. You're not going to get that same silhouette from one of those petticoats. You could maybe layer 5 of them together and get it, but then you're creating a custom thing already. So why not sew your own? So the difference is the amount of layers and the density of the gathering and the fabrics used. So we have done petticoats that are just one layer and they're a little closer to the body. We made one that had 3 layers of silk organza, and it was enormous. We started calling it the sea monster because it just took over the studio. It had these beautiful, I was calling it the jewels of the sea petticoat because it was beautiful, these lovely pastel tones. And it reminded me of this vintage ad called Jewels of the Sea for Rosemary Reed, who made swimsuits. And I kept calling it the Jewels of the Sea petticoat. And then we saw how big it was getting. And so it became the sea monster after that. But you can really build up so much volume through the layers.
The petticoat pattern that you have, is that based on a vintage petticoat that you had?
Yeah, we have a ton of petticoats in the Charm Studio. We actually started hanging them from the ceiling because we weren't sure where to store them. So we have a metal beam on our ceiling. It's really high. It's like 17-foot ceilings. And we got these magnetic hooks, and we store rows of petticoats on the ceiling. And it's so beautiful to look up at these all this candy colored pastel goodness. So we have a lot of petticoats, and some of them are vintage and some of them are, vintage reproductions. But yeah, I definitely spent a lot of time looking at what was the sort of the construction we wanted to reproduce and that our customers would want in their garments.
Is there any special need for a particular type of, say, crinoline? they were called crinolines. I don't know if they actually used crinoline in them. Do you have to get particular fabrics?
Yeah, they all, were made from different fabrics. I remember my mom complaining about wearing petticoats when she was little because they were made of really scratchy material and you would starch them, and she said they were so scratchy and she hated them, and she doesn't understand why I'm replicating this at all. But what I found is that they're made from different fabrics. You can use silk organza. Cotton organdy was another one that's a bit softer that was really popular in vintage petticoats. And I desperately wanted to recreate one until I saw how expensive good cotton organdy is. And I said, you know what? Maybe we won't do that. You know, when you're getting to like an $800 petticoat, you kind of have to rein it in a little bit.
Dial it back. Yeah.
Dial it back, Gertie. So yeah, we ended up doing, actually silk organza ended up being more economical than cotton organdy. But yeah, softer fabric. You don't have to use scratchy tulle. You know, there is something called can tulle, which I think is just a nightmare. It's so scratchy, but it does give you incredible volume. So I would say, you know, I tend to like woven fabrics for my petticoats rather than net, just because I think it gives you that sort of like softer, fluffier look.
It's a lot heavier though, no?
It can be. I mean, silk organza, you know, tends to be pretty light. But yeah, I think any sort of cotton would probably get fairly heavy.
Well, let me switch gears for a minute and ask you, we see you're working on the Hollywood Icons theme in 2025, and you've started with the Hollywood dress and then the Hollywood robe. Will you be dipping into more of the past before the 1950s? For example, the 50s seem to be your favorite, so
for sure they are.
And will there be some fitted bodices in there?
Yeah, so Hollywood Icons is our theme on Patreon this year, and that's where we have a sort of monthly subscription for content, video tutorials, and every year I choose a new theme. It's an amazing community of sewists who love vintage style. And so every year we do a new theme. We just launched this Hollywood Icons theme. I'm really excited about this one. So every month we're going to use a different icon as our inspiration. The Hollywood dress, the inspiration for that was Jean Harlow in the movie Dinner at 8. You know, the iconic photo of her wearing the dressing gown with the ostrich feather trim on the sleeves. And that one's more 30s inspired. And that was a little bit of a challenge for me because it's more of a softly draped bodice. It has pleats, you know, there's a little bit of blousing to it, which I'm not used to seeing in our bodices. So I had to get comfortable with that idea. And then the next few months, we're definitely going to be sticking more to our comfort zone with, you know, inspiration like Marilyn Monroe, Grace Kelly, you know, and these are all costumes designed by Edith Head. So you're looking at very fitted bodices, very much inspired by the new look. But I will say, we're going to be dabbling in different decades this year. I have a little bit of Ingrid Bergman inspiration coming up, which is very 40s. And then something Elizabeth Taylor 60s style, which I'm super excited about. So we are going to be branching out a little bit.
I better brush up on my old movies.
I mean, get that Turner Classic Movie Channel fired up. This is like my favorite thing to do, like while I'm sketching, is just see what's on TCM and find inspiration there.
I hope you'll do you know, the suit with the blouse that Grace Kelly wears in Rear Window. It's kind of a pale green, I think. And then she takes off the jacket and it's backless, the white blouse.
I do know which one you mean. I love that movie. And well, we're not doing that one. We do have something Rear Window inspired coming up. Yeah.
We're looking forward to it. Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's going to be a really fun year.
Well, Gretchen, we've been talking and the time has just flown by. If folks want to learn more about you or charm patterns and what you're up to next, where should they go?
So you can go to my Instagram, which is @Gertie18, and there you can see all of our recent designs on Patreon and through Charm Patterns. You can also go to my website, www.charmpatterns.com.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Oh, my gosh.
The time really did go by fast. And we appreciate all of your tips and advice. And for links to some of the things we talked about today, see this episode's notes at threadsmagazine.com. Well, thank you, Gretchen. We appreciate your time. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun to catch up with you both.
Thanks.
Thank you to our guests for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send your comments, questions, and suggestions to th@threadsmagazine.com, and please like, comment, and subscribe wherever you are listening. Until next time, keep on sewing with threads.